I had the pleasure of volunteering today to moderate this.
We so appreciate it.
When I heard that Ann was a certified expert on artisanal cheeses, knowing my last name is Romano, I had to moderator at
This is it. It was fate.
So without further ado, I will be presenting Ann Campbell and her project, titled Shepherding Science and Structure, Louis Jean Marie Daubenton's Animal Husbandry, Anatomy and Mineralogy. So without further ado.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. I do know of one artisanal producer of Pecorino Romano, so we'll be in touch about that.
Feel free to bring samples.
Yeah. We'll do a cheese talk at another time, I promise. So, and thank you for the Ostrom workshop for this opportunity. It's been really good for me to wrap my head around my dissertation in a new way that I desperately needed to do. So, like James said, I'm Ann Campbell. I'm an Ostrom Fellow. I am a PhD candidate here at IU in the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine. And I know that that's a lot of words for one department, and it doesn't really help describe what I or any given person in that department does. But in a nutshell, I'm a historian of science. I'm a historian and my object of study is science. And I'm an 18th centuryist, and that is a space that I sort of fell into. I didn't go looking for 18th centuryism, but I fell into it because I'm interested in exploring ideas that are at once political and scientific. And the 18th century is just a space where these revelations, like between the human and the natural, are really explicitly being made. So the work that I'm presenting here today is really a broad overview of some of the themes that I'm discussing in my dissertation, which I'm using this as a way to tie together what is otherwise a very organic organization of standalone chapters, which is how I've been discussing the work to date, but for the most part, right? And this talk has really given me a chance to look at some different elements which surround or connect these chapters. So my dissertation surrounds the life and work of the French naturalist Louis Jean Marie Daubenton. And Daubenton is a key figure in 18th century French natural history, but he predominantly exists in the historiography as a sidekick, as a counterexample, or as a precursor, right? He's a sidekick to the notorious Comte de Buffon, his co-author, collaborator, and childhood friend. He's a counterexample to the British agriculturalist Robert Bakewell, who, like Daubenton, pursues projects of wool improvement. And he's often a precursor to an era of scientific breeding and a new field of genetics, which would really take off in the 19th century, right? But my aim is to tell a story that centers Daubenton, right? As a leader, as a collaborator, not an assistant, right? At his home institution of the Jardin des Plantes, and as an essential figure in the development of natural historical disciplines like animal anatomy, zoology, mineralogy, really laying the groundwork for how these fields were approached or even revolutionized by his institutional and disciplinary descendants at the Jardin in the 19th century. So, I will start with a quick bio sketch of Daubenton, as I don't really want to dwell on the biographical elements so much as the themes that I'm identifying to explore his work. So Daubenton is born in the Burgundian town of Montbard in 1716. He's born into and raised in a shepherding family, right? Daubenton was by trade, so to speak, a shepherd, and well into his adult life. And his family in Montbard was friends with another local family of a very different social class, where he befriended his future collaborator, the Comte de Buffon, right? And even though there is a main goal of this project to decenter Buffon, Buffon remains key to the story. So Buffon really takes up the lion's share of space in both the historiography and the popular imagination of 18th century French natural history. And This is a bit by his own design, right? Buffon was a self-promoter, right? A socialite, always seeking status and visibility. He was not quite an aristocrat. Those lines are very important in 18th century France, right? But he really wanted to be. He was definitely of a higher class, right? And he constructed an image of himself to be perceived as an aristocrat. And this is very interesting when we consider Daubenton's own image, his own social status and legacy, which is that of a humble shepherd, right? A hometown hero, compared to Buffon's status as a Parisian socialite, a national figure. They both grew up in Montbard, and they both practiced in the city. But for childhood friends, they really come to represent two very different spaces. Daubenton studies medicine in Paris, which of course at this time is pretty much the typical entry into scientific training and practice. And he had intended to return to Montbard for a small town medical practice, very much in line in his image. But Buffon, having drawn him to attend all of these courses and demonstration at the Jardin des Plantes, convinced him to instead come work as a professor at the Jardin des Plantes, the Parisian institution which held the natural history cabinets and the botanical gardens, and which Buffon was managing. And I want to call attention to the significance of the Jardin des Plantes for this story as both a site of scientific practice and a site of public engagement. So even before an era of Buffon and Daubenton, the Jardin was engaged in this kind of programming. So the Jardin was a royal institution, right? Owned and to some degree operated by the crown. It was founded in the 17th century as a botanical garden and a site to train physicians in pharmacology. But it was also a place to house the king's cabinet, right? A collection of natural historical specimens that kind of showed off the wealth of the nation, right? And this rapidly grew as a scientific collection and a site of both scientific practice and public programming. So the era of Buffon and Daubenton at the Jardin expanded not only the facilities and the staff and the collections and so on, but also in the public programming. So public demonstrations in anatomy, in chemistry, botany, mineralogy, and so on for scientific practitioners from a range of Parisian institutions, right? This wasn't just for folks at the Jardin. People would come from all over to have this education. This was standard programming. The Jardin was also an urban space for citizens, Parisian citizens, to experience nature with the expansion of the botanical gardens, the addition of the menagerie, an increased interest in agriculture among landowners, both as a hobby and as a source of wealth, led to a number of programs of scientific research that were translated to public-facing improvement projects. And of note, we have Buffon and Daubenton's massive, exhaustive, evergreen print project of the Histoire Naturelle. Right? This is the major scientific work of 18th century France to catalog and describe all the animals. That's what they start with, ideally everything. And this is a project that is passed down through generations, right? I think they managed to get four of their key groups out in the time that they're working on it. So and this is both a scientific work and a public-facing project, right? And it's in the sense that it's a public-facing project in an era of print culture, right? It's for the enlightenment of society through the experience of nature. And the Jardin, famously, is one of the only French scientific institutions to survive intact across the Revolution into the New Republic, which I argue is largely due to its status as a public-facing institution engaged in projects of applied natural history. So Daubenton's work, especially the work that was performed at the Jardin, shows his breadth of skill. As a professor at the Jardin, in addition to his authorship on the Histoire Naturelle, he led the public demonstrations and he was in charge of the curation of the King's Cabinet, right? He put order to it. But disciplinarily, Daubenton's expertise fell into three categories: animal husbandry, anatomy, and mineralogy. And this is nice news for someone like myself who needs to write 3 chapters on Daubenton, bound by an introduction and conclusion, right? So there's an organic division of topics here, but there are definitely overlaps. And in terms of animal husbandry, right, we don't just have Daubenton's experience as a shepherd, we also have his scientific work for livestock improvement, particularly his work to improve the wool quality in French sheep. Daubenton eventually holds posts at the Alfort Veterinary School. He's a key player in the Rambouillet experimental farm, and he writes both a scientific treatise, right, an academy-facing version, and a farmer's manual, the public-facing version. Though, to be fair, these are 2 different kinds of professional expertise, right? And he writes 2 versions of his work on the acclimatization and management of sheep for improved wool production. And Daubenton's anatomy is not disconnected from his animal husbandry, and I argue he develops this tacit skill in anatomy due to his expertise with livestock, that he has this sort of privileged breeder's gaze of seeing the animal, right? And Daubenton is responsible for the extensive anatomical sections in the Histoire Naturelle, which generalizes the animal form, but also describes the particular specimens in the cabinet, right? And Daubenton does extensive demonstrations on anatomy. He does public dissections, right? This is including for education for physicians and veterinarians. And this emphasizes the understanding of a general form, right? Getting to know the animal, not just the specifics of this animal or that animal, right? And he's the first to include fossil parts in these demonstrations as a means of comparison. And Daubenton is very much forming a new science of comparative anatomy that geometricizes the body, right? It generalizes form as more than the sum of parts and orders animals based on similarities and differences, which is significant to the role of anatomy at the institution. And Daubenton has a similar contribution to mineralogy, which feels a little more detached from the natural convergence of animal husbandry and anatomy. And it's the element of Daubenton's work which has received, well, it's been given the least amount of attention in the historiography, but I want to make some connections between his mineralogy and his other areas of expertise. And first is that mineralogy, like animal husbandry, has always been a sort of applied natural science, right? It relies on the tacit skill of non-scientific professionals, and that the professional science in turn is in service to the mining industry. And secondly, Daubenton's mineral system has a lot of similarity to his approach to animal anatomy, right? This is also working from specimens in the cabinet, but the way that he is describing minerals and the way he wants us to identify them comes down to an understanding of form and structure. And I'll touch on that a bit more. And like I said, though, I have sort of organically organized set of chapters. My prep for this talk has really let me step away from that a little bit, from this 3-discipline organization, and let me flesh out more of the themes that I'm discussing across the disciplines, right? Themes that establish the context these chapters sit in, and themes that connect these chapters. So this ugly diagram is a diagram of something that exists in my head, but hey, this is the first step into turning it into words. And I'm trying to see how these themes here sit outside of the disciplinary stories, these themes at the top, how they build a historical and social context for those stories, and how they how these themes on the bottom are kind of internal to the disciplinary stories, right? And ultimately make connections between the 3 chapters. And of course, this is not cut and dried. Some of these themes may be doing work in both the contextual and internal categories, but this is how I've been able to reimagine how I talk about this. I'm discussing public-facing science, right? The kind of science we've seen being done at the Jardin, and this notion of applied natural history, right? That is that these purely natural cabinet sciences are actually born of their utilitarian purposes in various crafts or industries. I'm looking at the different spaces of science, right? The cabinet, the living collections, the farm, inside the academy and outside the academy, across an urban-rural divide as well. And with this comes the theme of rural expertise, something that Daubenton has and wields, right? But this is also a kind of subjugated knowledge that really needs some attention in the history of science. And then internal to the disciplines, I have themes of biogeography and climate and of structuralism, right? Which kind of ties this flow from animal husbandry to anatomy to mineralogy. I've already spoken a little bit about the role of public-facing science at the Jardin, and Daubenton is absolutely conducting public-facing science, right? Through demonstrations, through the Histoire Naturelle project, and really by virtue of being in charge of the collections, right? There's a value in science for the people through the work at the Jardin. And Daubenton's sheep improvement project was a call to action by the state. France had a growing textile industry, a reputation for fine things, but it was buying wool, and often sheep, from Spain because French wool was just bad. And Daubenton's job was to improve French wool and improve French sheep for the sake of the French economy and reputation, right? And ultimately he does this. And I'll talk a little bit more about how he gets there later, but he publishes this, like I said, as a scientific work, but also a farmer's manual, a guide for the shepherds of France. So the program he develops can actually be put into place, right? Not just theoretically better French wool, but actually better French wool. And this, of course, is not entirely distinct from the theme of applied natural history, right? Public-facing science is a bit more about the audience of scientific practice or education, and the applied natural history speaks a little more to the origin of natural knowledge and the service of that natural knowledge, right? So I'm drawing on a certain tradition in the history of science that focuses on artisanal and craft knowledge, right? The world of engineers and miners and, yes, farmers as those manipulating nature through problem solving, producing knowledge in the process, right? And this is as opposed to a narrative of pure scientific knowledge being handed down for the use in technology. And I want to see how the Jardin is a site where gardeners and farmers and animal breeders and miners and dye makers and so on are contributing, producing and contributing natural knowledge. But I also want to see how the seemingly detached urban spectacles of nature, right? These neatly ordered cabinet collections managed by academy-trained practitioners are producing knowledge that is in service to industry and agriculture, right? And how these different kinds of practitioners are commingling. So Daubenton's animal anatomy is taught to physicians and veterinarians. Like I said, they are taught to learn this generalized form, right, this standard in nature, in service to being better medical practitioners, right? Better observers of their own objects. And Daubenton's improved sheep, which are exhibited in the menagerie as a success story of his program, show how a product of natural history is applied science, right? And Daubenton's sheep are key to the survival of the institution across the revolution into the New Republic, being brought to the National Assembly as an example of the utilitarian role of studies of nature. Learn anatomy, be a better observer, raise better sheep, make France less reliant on imported wool, right? The Natural History Museum is for the nation of France to help itself. But this specific kind of artisanal expertise I want to discuss in this project has not only an economic and a social distinction, but also a geographic distinction, right? And that's between the urban and the rural. And this story plays out between these spaces with Daubenton professionally trained in Paris, situated in this massive Parisian institution for which not exclusively, but a lot of the public facing elements are for Parisians, right? Who don't otherwise have some kind of access to nature. And many of the practitioners are likewise centered in this urban space, right? Not just at this institution, but Paris being a metropole of professional science in the 18th century. But Owen is special, right? He's from the countryside. He's from a community of shepherds. He's a practicing shepherd himself, right? And farmers of all sorts have an epistemological privilege in the production of natural knowledge. And this is because of their access to and their experience with nature, plants, animals, landscapes, climate, all the processes among and between these, right? They constantly tend to and respond to the needs and constraints of nature and engage in a problem-solving process that facilitates this production of knowledge, right? This knowledge is also often tacit, right? It's unarticulated. It's the knowledge that comes from hand skill and from experience. It's a kind of knowledge that is still, this tacit knowledge is still essential to the production of scientific knowledge in other spaces, right? The science is about the manipulation of materials. It's about the familiarity and the ability to know one's object of study. So I argue that Daubenton has a unique expertise as both a shepherd and an anatomist, right? Due to this duality in experience. Training as a shepherd gives him this tacit skill from working with livestock, something that most academy-trained anatomists would not have. And his work as an anatomist, trained with a range of animals, doing the work of observation, measurement, tabulation, generalization, lets him return to animal husbandry with a privileged skill that he may not have as a shepherd alone. And here we see the spaces of science play out, right? Not just the concentration of the academy scientific practice and training in the urban space, but the concentration of the museum cabinet in the urban space where the animals of the world are consolidated and understood, right? And then the rural space, the farm, where applied natural history is actively being practiced with live animals associated with the home, often associated with a particular region or landscape and the production of wealth through the land, right? And Daubenton carries a privileged view from one space to the other and back. And this isn't simply an epistemological privilege. This is a social privilege, right? Daubenton manages to garner and wield social clout in both of these spaces. He is neither a country bumpkin to his Parisian scientific colleagues, right? Nor is he this fancy outsider to his farming community. And this, especially the latter part, is significant to the success of Daubenton's work. So I've already mentioned several times that Daubenton's wool improvement experiments result in two works, right? The academy-facing scientific work and a practical farmer's manual written for shepherds to put the program into practice. And the farmer's manual in general, right, it's a popular genre in the 18th century. Many agricultural scientists are attempting to translate their work into a lay language, which is a term I really don't like because, as I argue, farmers are experts in their own right? But there is this attempt to deliver the modern science of improvement to practicing farmers. And it usually stalls. It doesn't usually go over so well, right? Naturally, there's resentment among the farmers. They know that they're experts. They do their own problem solving. They don't need academy expertise to do that for them, right? And farmers' manuals and the programs they want to put in place often fall flat, right? But this is a very different story with Daubenton. And because he's a shepherd, because he is an experienced, well-respected member of this community of herdsmen. And his manual, his translation of scientific results into a practical, on-the-ground management program is well-received. Shepherds do change their practices. They do actually improve the quality of French wool because Daubenton is not only able to produce, but to deliver this program, right? Owing, I argue, to this dual expertise and this dual social status. So those are some of the outside themes, the contextual themes, right? Themes that I think these chapters all exist in and speak to. This is largely about social ideas in which these scientific disciplines exist, which I know may be far more interesting to a room full of primarily social scientists of all different sorts. But I want to touch on some of the themes that are internal to the science, right? Some ideas that either drive how Daubenton is approaching animal husbandry, anatomy, or mineralogy, or how these ideas emerge from his work in these specialties. So first is the role of climate and geography and how these are tied to animal form. This connects Daubenton to his collaborator Buffon, and it's key to how Daubenton approaches and achieves his sheep improvement project. So Buffon and Daubenton share the idea that the very material form, that is, the very molecules that make up an animal body and the particular shape that they organize themselves into, are driven by air, water, soil, climate, etc., of where that animal lives, right? But there is a natural geographic order to this, right? A species' native range is where it has its ideal form. And that form begins to degenerate when it's moved elsewhere. This form no longer aligned perfectly with its climate and landscape. So for Buffon, biogeography is the foundation of the order of nature. But the idea of degeneration is also coupled with an opportunity for regeneration, right? An animal moved from its native range could become acclimatized to the new landscape and climate through exposure to air, soil, water, climate, and so on, and actually changed its form to become aligned with the new location. And this is exactly what's behind Daubenton's sheep improvement. So as far as he and Buffon and the nation of France are concerned, French wool is bad because sheep are not from France, right? And if French wool is to be good, if French stock is to be good, it needs to be imported from Spain, which is thought to be the native range of sheep, right? But Daubenton wants to see if he can acclimatize Spanish sheep to the French landscape and climate. Improve their wool by making them native, and most importantly, right, by making them French. And he's able to do this by balancing the breeding of Spanish sheep every few generations, right, bringing in these ideal forms with the exposure to the French climate. Not too much, but enough that they become French, right, through management methods and through open-sided stalls, essentially, to kind of mitigate too much French climate and not enough French climate, right? And this incorporation of native ideal Spanish sheep preserves the wool quality, and regeneration is countering degeneration, right? And an ideal form is able to be transplanted. So for Daubenton, though, this is where he's really deviating from Buffon when it comes to the idea of the order of nature. It's form that is the foundation of the order of nature, right? Animals are where they are geographically because their form aligns. And Daubenton finds geographic gradients as a gradient of form. But both Daubenton and Buffon consider this connection to climate and landscape and some degree of opportunity for change in form based on a change in location. And as I mentioned, Daubenton is responsible for developing a new kind of comparative anatomy, the goal of which is understanding the form itself, right? Daubenton identifies core forms that place animals into different categories, working from the internal organs outwards to the extremities. Similarities at the center of the animal unite species into groups, and differences at the extremities are going to separate them. And Daubenton uses a mathematicized approach to identifying and characterizing the form of the animal, using tables to set up ratios between measurements of parts, right? Making the identity of a type dependent not only on the presence or absence of parts, but on their relation to each other. So these recorded tables kind of become the identity of the animal form themselves. There's some conflation between the table as it is written as a grid and then this notion of like the tableau of the body plan of the organism, right? So, and this becomes a means by which animals can be compared to each other. So comparative anatomy becomes a comparison of parts within wholes, right? Facilitating the comparison of whole animals to each other and defining wholes not as a series of parts, but as parts that fit together, patterns that we can find across species. All right. So this structuralism also carries into his work on minerals. Daubenton's aim is to have a system of minerals where specimens can be identified as their own wholes, right? Daubenton rejects the chemical analysis that's being done at other scientific organizations in Paris as too reductionist, as ignoring, even destroying the structure of the mineral, right? Daubenton is among the first to make a geometric description of a mineral's crystallographic structure, right? Counting points and faces in a manner that dictates a gross form. This is much in the same manner that he is demonstrating the gross form of an animal through a ratio of parts. And it's the crystal form that distinguishes one mineral from another and is what should be used to organize minerals in the cabinet, but also to identify minerals in the field. And this is not a one-off divergence. It's not a blip in the history of science. This is the foundation of what would become the standard in the 19th century for both zoology and its new science of form, morphology, and in mineralogy, which would become based in crystallography, which rejected reductionist chemical analysis in favor of structure. And this is seen in what is sometimes called the golden age of the museum, right? As it's called, of the Jardin des Plantes. Specifically with the practitioners who would take over the posts of comparative anatomy and mineralogy, respectively Georges Cuvier, who famously employed a structural concept of organismal identity in which the form of one part dictated or constrained the form of another, right? And who also proliferated the comparison of fossil and extant forms. He's a major figure in the history of comparative anatomy, zoology, and paleontology. And perhaps not as celebrated as Cuvier, at least in the sense that geology is just not as celebrated as anatomy. We also see René Just Houy, who is given the moniker of the father of crystallography, spurring this new form of mineralogy and of chemistry, which relied on structure. Right? Houey's work is how we are able to arrive at a science of chemistry that goes beyond an empirical formula to understand how molecules take different shapes, right, and manifest into higher order forms. So contents alone are not adequate. But these boons in zoology and mineralogy are not products alone of the 19th century. They're not products of these characters, right? They're an extension of Daubenton's work as a structuralist and contingent on his work to preserve the museum into the next generation. So thank you.
Of course, thank you. So we'll monitor online too, James, if it's helpful.
Okay. Oh, yes, that would be very helpful.
I got it up.
All right, so we will now move the questions in the tradition of the research series. We'll first ask for questions, of course, from students and then move on to other professors who may have questions. So at this time, if anyone has any questions.
I feel like a student right now.
I
do, but no.
All students.
Students, go ahead, please. Okay, I'm really excited. I should say I'm a fan of yours, just to put it mild. And I appreciate your writing that we've done together, but I see it coming across in what you shared with us. And just reminds me of why social studies, mostly US history, was my undergrad major and how much I enjoyed this. So thank you for this presentation today. I really appreciate it. So a lot of questions and comments come to mind, but I'll ask one and then I'll turn the floor over to others and I'll come back to you again later. But I want to know, how do you see this work applying to contemporary issues today throughout the academy, throughout society? I mean, I see a ton of application. I want to hear what you see.
Okay, so I don't usually think of it as how this could, how I could make this relevant to the 21st century, but rather where can I look in the 21st century to sort of ground what I'm trying to say here? But that's because I'm a historian. But the first place is in the role of extension services.
That's my first one.
Right? That's really where I'm drawing from this idea of like the back and forth between the academy expertise and the rural practitioner, right? And this problem of highfalutin White Tower academy science being delivered and how an extension service is supposed to be bidirectional, but too often it is only unidirectional, right? And how can we better, not only better deliver academy science in a way that matters to practicing farmers, but how can we better, more importantly, incorporate the expertise of farmers into the choices of what kinds of academy science are being done for agriculture, right? So the extension program is definitely like a point of reference that I write about for this, like the failure of the farmer's manual.
Yeah.
Why Daubenton has success here. And then in other words, if we want to just think about what's the lesson, what's the social lesson here, is that we need to both understand what academy expertise means, right? We're all associated with academy expertise in one way or another. We all get angry when like some guy online who read all the books about the Lincoln assassination at the public library is claiming to do their own research, right? But we also need to better understand different kinds of expertise that are non-professional or different professional expertises, right? The academy is not the only place that breeds expertise or even the best place to breed expertise, right?
Yeah, it just so happened this weekend, I ended upon a farm of one of the people you interviewed for our
Mhm.
project. And he was like, oh, I want to talk to her some more. I learned at the end that she is an expert in cheese. And the dairy farmer wants to talk to you more because he was, and that, like, it really excited him about your expertise in that sector of dairy.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I saw, I mean, just this past weekend, I heard that connection of, the farmer viewing your expertise, like, and just really changed the way he thought about you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not just some kid making calls to write a paper about, right? They aren't a stranger to me.
Yeah, and you spoke the language.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I've got more. But thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you.
Questions, but is it okay? Okay. Thank you, Anne, for your presentation. I'm also a big fan of your work, and this is fascinating. When I was a historian of science, I was reading how Dupont's ideas traveled to the Americas and particularly to the Nueva Granada, and that is fascinating. And that has two questions related to that. I have two questions. One is if you found in your work how all of these studies of the natural order are really blueprints for imagining the social order. So yeah, that line is really not very clear. And I think that the things that you notice about the urban-rural division then get exploded, like blown up when we think about geographical determinism in the colony. So that is my first question. And the second question is, if the category of public facing is yours, or if you found like literally the concept of public facing. And I ask that because I think that, of course, a big task that the scientists had was to build their audience, as you already mentioned. And that is super important as well when these ideas travel elsewhere, because then they're taken up by the Criollo elite. So it is the Creoles who then claim that they are the ones who can be the audience for that science, because the rest of the populations were impossible to educate. So almost like there's a limit to the acclimatization process, and then education cannot fix the things that nature imposes, kind of thing. So I guess my second question that is connected to the first one is, how do you see that process of building an audience, which is so important to this, and that goes beyond merely reception theory, but it goes, like, how do they really create their own public, in the public facing science they do?
Fantastic. So in terms of this first question, absolutely, there is a connection between the natural order and the social order, right? As if I take even a step further and talk about the things that just surround the dissertation as a whole, right, is definitely it's a Buffon and Montesquieu, and how Buffon and Montesquieu are basically doing the same thing, right? Because Buffon has these ideas that there are geographical gradients of animal form, and Montesquieu is saying that there are geographical gradients in forms of governance, degrees of freedom, right? What kind of culture you have. And they are both, surprise, making an argument of latitude, and guess where the 45th parallel is? Oh, it runs right through France. France is the ideal location. And if we can just bring everything to France, everybody can be educated and become free, and we can acclimatize all of our crops and on neutral soil and then send them all over the world to be propagated, right? So absolutely, there is this connection. I'm very interested, right, because you bring this up on a global level, which I think is how it's mostly spoken of. I'm very interested in how this happens on a regional level, right? Because this is also where we see sort of the hyper-regionalism of France, right? There is, when he's doing these sheep projects, it's also like, well, let's get sheep from Burgundy and let's get sheep from Toulouse and let's get Basque sheep. They're almost Spanish, right? So I'm very much interested in how this plays out not just as an imperial project, but as a national project, right? And I mean, the reason I'm attracted to these scientific and political ideas is because they still exist in notions like terroir and PDO systems. This is the talk we heard last semester about gastrofascism, is also very much grounded in this era of science. So
In popular books like Germs, Guns, and Steel.
yes.
Same
Yes. Yes. So here's the thing. This Buffon, Lamarck, we all took intro bio. We know that that doesn't win. We get genetics and we get Darwin and we get a British view of the foundation of a natural order, right? We all know that genetics is so tightly wound up with eugenics, and that is repeatedly problematized in the literature. This view, which goes by the wayside, is tied up in environmental determinism, which still persists like in disciplines of geography, which still persists in a lot of, PDOs and terroir, but a lot of this popular imagination, like the Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it is not as problematized in the literature, right? So I think this rural-urban tension is something that I'm looking at a national level.
And then the public, the public facing is your concept?
The public facing comes out of a lot of work in museum studies, particularly in scientific museum studies. So there is a typical narrative that says that the 18th century is when museums, natural history museums, and all museums kind of become public facing, that before that it was something that, for the king or for fancy people to just show off the cool things that they have. Right. And then there's another narrative that says that in natural history museums, this doesn't really happen until the late 19th, early 20th century, right? Where this becomes more of a public space where like the proletariat can go for a fun day of education. But I'm breaking through some of that by showing that the Jardin, like even before the 18th century, was always a public facing. They always did public programming, like from its inception. So that language is mostly coming from museum studies literature.
super cool, like proto public.
Yeah.
Something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a fascinating project. And as an historian, I know like people are, super amazing and kind of weaving the narrative out of, so I super loved your talk. I have two questions. The first, I think there is a little ambivalence in terms of your use of nature. There are two spaces where nature is urban space and rural space. Right? So in urban space, where it's curated, and in rural space, which is natural nature. So I don't know. It seems like in your work you valorize certain kind of more embodied knowledge of rural spaces over um, over the knowledge that is created through kind of museification of nature or putting nature in the lab. And I was wondering, like, does that question this division between two types of nature, valorizing rural over urban nature, or does that reify that divide that actually serves the purpose of science? That we know the nature more than them because we control, we do all the experiments. So it kind of ends up doing like the other kind of politics that you want to do with promoting this subjugated knowledge or this epistemological silence that seems to be informing the knowledge of the urban science, right? So I was just wondering, and the second, I just wanted to ask you, like, is Christoph on your committee, or do you work with him, Christoph, I'm sure?
Christoph did, what's the word I'm looking for? He moderated my paper for the Ostrom course I took last semester, but is not on my committee. Do you have?
I'm talking about Christoph Irmscher, right?
Yeah.
So his book, Poetics of Natural History, has a first chapter that is super amazing. And it says like, while we were curating nature, or we were making nature, we were making ourselves. It kind of goes back to Diana's question of natural and social order. And that kind of then relates to the production of science at a particular moment in history that ultimately ends up being a global imperial project, colonial project. It's the same period when tropical medicine becomes like a big thing, and the European subject becomes the valued center of that discipline, right? So I was just wondering, like, what kind of implications that knowledge have for global politics of 18th century Europe. And just a small more detail, farmers' manual in England were much more successful, or weren't they at that point?
I mean, I think it's still a mixed bag, right? And I think that how they get put into practice is not, it's not as elegant, right? And there's also more technology involved, like when you think about like the seed drill, right? Because then that is also another material form of thing that needs to be delivered, so.
Oh, fascinating.
But, okay. I'm not so sure that there are two kinds of nature. I mean, maybe there are two kinds of nature here, but between the urban and rural, but I don't think that it is that that it's pure nature in the rural and then curated nature in the city, right? I think that the farm is still curated nature. So I don't think it's that I'm not trying to compare different kinds of nature so much as I'm comparing different kinds of work, right? Different kinds of work with the nature and how that is producing different kinds of knowledge. And both of which I argue are science, but only one of which we call science, right? So I think it's about the labor here. And then in terms of the global implications for this is a global politics. There are, within my project, not so much, but there is still a ton written about what happens with these acclimatization projects as soon as like the 19th century. I say as soon as because I mean like 1801, right? Of how these are a global imperial colonial project for France in the propagation of crops. Because they're using these ideas, they're using the botanical garden as a place to bring crops to neutralize them, right? And then they can, like I said, they can take them back to they can bring them from one colony and then go grow them in another colony, right?
Professor Shackelford, do we have any online question?
Yeah.
Follow up. Please write that paper about labor and nature. That is, that connection, this connection is super important. And one of the things, I don't think we have enough work on that. I think, that usually it's either you study one or the other. The connections between the two are so important for thinking about your work.
It's also really important, right? This isn't just to be like, farmers are awesome and cabinet scientists aren't, right? It's still like even in the past century and very much today, this certain skill in natural history of working with specimens, of doing taxonomy, of doing morphology is really, really seen as like not real science. And that really bothers me, right? So there's a certain labor, like there's an understanding of organisms that comes from that kind of scientific practice that people who we affectionately call gene jockeys, right, who just like do reductionist laboratory biology, just don't know organisms in the same way. So I think that that's an opportunity to also champion that kind of work.
Super
Right.
cool.
Interesting. Like our first state forester was actually a pharmacist,
Uh-huh.
but he was just sort of as an individual, he studied the woods. And then he became the first state forester. And I'm trying to like, what is the connection between like sort of that medical world and the natural world and like the lessons that I learned back?
Yeah, Buffon was a forester too.
I think and you are both right, but you have to wait until the Industrial Revolution for those two natures to be separated and settled down as the natural nature that is rural and then the curated nature that is urban. It is, an Industrial Revolution project, and I'm thinking, of course, with Raymond Williams and others about parks and the role of curated nature within cities.
And
So,
yeah,
you're both right, but it is a matter of time.
When is Williams? When does Williams sort of?
It is Industrial Revolution, so
So-
when
So after Olmsted.
people start
Okay.
going into the factory, which was a crazy project.
Yeah.
Then the idea of having nature within the city was giving them a respite.
What's his name? Williams? What's his name?
Raymond Williams.
Thanks.
and because there's not just tracking the history of what folks are actually doing, but on top of that, tracking and also a rapidly changing history of the notion of nature and where it is, right? Because we do see a switch from the idea of the farm being nature to the farm being curated nature, right?
I had a question, and you touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if the personal relationship between Daubenton and Buffon impacted perhaps Buffon's approach towards the more practical knowledge of the pasture of the farmer. Did that relationship play at all into like the, I guess, local knowledge question?
The relationship between Buffon and Daubenton, on what end? On Daubenton's end?
On perhaps Buffon's end.
Yeah, that's a good question. Buffon's kind of a mystery in this sense because he didn't grow up as a shepherd, right? He grew up not an aristocrat, but just almost an aristocrat. But he has this same kind of like small town upbringing, the same kind of access to this kind of rural knowledge and nature, but I'm not sure if he has a desire to like detach himself from this because he wants to be an aristocrat. He wants to move to Paris and wear fancy clothes and get his portrait painted. But I'm not sure. It's kind of a mystery there. Why doesn't Buffon want to do this? And why is Daubenton so content to just be the hometown hero. Because if you go to Montbard, I mean, Buffon's the most famous person from this little town, right? But there are statues of Buffon all over Paris. There are statues of Daubenton all over Montbard. That's who they love. He's the guy who came back and raised sheep, right? I love him there. I've seen so many newspaper articles from like the 1980s about like Daubenton in the Montbard Times. We love this guy.
Our guy.
So I wonder,
Cover right there.
I'd be curious, because I've never read either one of their farm magazines or their farm reports, or I don't know, what did you
The
call it?
Farmer's Manual.
Farmer's Manual. But I wonder what the similarities were, if you could do like an analysis between that and George Washington Carver's Tuskegee Station
Huh.
bulletins.
Huh.
Those were insanely popular
Yeah.
amongst the black farmers of the
Yeah.
South. And so I wonder, like, is there some sort of literary comparison between the two that might draw out why both of this, and again, Carver was also a farmer,
Yeah.
so I don't know, just comes to mind.
You know, I was thinking of Hoosier connections, and I'm up from northern Indiana, so Gene Stratton Porter was
Yes.
someone that came to my head as like
Yeah, yeah.
similar case study, so.
Also very good with the natural history cabinet.
Yes.
Yeah.
I also wanted to wanted you to say a little bit more about how, like, this dialectics, or not dialectics, but like drifting between degeneration and regeneration sort of makes him closer to Darwin in a way, and kind of jump the structuralism.
Sure. So I mean,
Instead of like staying within the kind of like stiff structures of the.
okay, I think I see what you're getting at. Is the idea about an opportunity for change?
Mm.
Okay, so as far as there being sort of change or in organic beings change, and I talk about animals here because they just never quite get to the plants thing. It doesn't mean that they aren't also thinking about this in terms of plants. I'm not wild about marking Darwin in the history of science as like the start of this. I consider myself a historian of evolutionary biology, but I'm still an 18th centuryist, right? So I think that this opportunity for change is still very much in both Buffon and Daubenton. And that change, again, comes from the moving of an organism to a different climate. Buffon also thinks that you can move organisms to change a climate. He thinks that if you plant a forest, rain will come. But Buffon and Daubenton, I think, have different ideas of whether or not speciation can occur. Right? So I think that Buffon accepts an idea that something could theoretically change enough that it becomes a new species. And I think that Daubenton just sees, and again, he's a shepherd. He sees 150 different breeds of sheep, right? But they're all sheep. So I think that Daubenton wants to see an opportunity for change in form, but it never quite turns into the next thing.
He sees zonation, not speciation.
Say that
He
again?
sees zonation, not species.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a natural break point, right at that one. So thank you to Anne. Can I ask any closing thoughts or reflections or plans to take, where you take?
Well, I mean, the plan, I'm gonna write a dissertation and
Right.
hopefully become a doctor. Get back on
Those
paper.
details, right? Yeah.
So that's kind of where my head is, but thank you. This was a much needed thought experiment for me to reapproach how I'm digging into this work. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. And grab cookies.
Just talking a lot. I'm super in love with that work. It's amazing. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, in terms of what the first question was around.
Perfect. And did you sign? Yes,
Like
perfect.
the application of this project right now. So I'm thinking of development or global development, sort of the ideas that are developed in the global academy in the West kind of then go out to inform.
Yes.
And, you know, the greatest example is the Green Revolution. You know?
Yes, I was
Yes.
thinking of Bogart when you were.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's a lot of that in this acclimatization program with the crops.
Right. Yeah.